talked before about Professor Ken Macrorie, who's the author of one of the best books that I've ever read about writing called Telling Writing. And I got so interested in what he was doing just through that one book that I went and dug up as many other things as I could find that he had his name on. And so far, I've been richly rewarded for it. And one of the best things that I've found is a book called Uptaught. Let me put it over here instead. And Uptaught is subtitled, A Professor Discovers His Students on the Way to a New University. And it was written in 1970, 1971, thereabouts. And it is essentially the story of how Professor Macrorie discovered that he had as much to learn from his students as his students had to learn from him. And this happened over a course of many years. It happened over the course of a number of different educational institutions, all of which in time made Professor Macrorie realize that the way higher education works is unfortunately reflective of the way of a lot of education works, that it tends to be an assembly line process where people are put in one end and they're supposed to come out the other end as scholars. And unfortunately, that's not how learning works. And so he was constantly frustrated with all of the machine teaching type of systems that were getting in the way of any actual learning. And he learned how to break that down a little bit and to transform it in his classes, to try and get people to stop giving him, first of all, to stop giving him mechanical responses to things in their essays and compositions, to be personal, to open up, and to think about these things that were being put in front of them in ways that were not simply about pleasing the professor or getting the teacher to shut up. And that was the hardest thing for him, is he realized that so much of education, especially higher education, revolves around those kinds of things. It's not really about getting your ideas out there. It's about getting ideas out there that make the professor happy so you get a good grade. And in time, he came to hate this. And the book is, it's broken into a lot of very short chapters, anecdotes really, that talk about how these experiences transformed him and his students. And it's organized into a number of rough categories that are reflective of the evolution of his ideas over time. And one of the most important things that came out of this was his feeling about what he described as the third way for education. And this was happening at a time when, of course, the universities were in all tremendous upheaval. And he was responding to that and trying in a way to do his own things that were complementary to it. But he found out that it was a lot more difficult than he realized. And the section where he explicitly spells out what his new paradigm was is simply called Sight, and it's dated April 14th, 1966. And it reads, I began to see how school is really taught in America, from kindergarten through graduate school. In the first way, the teacher hands out a package of information and tests to see whether students can remember its content. The package contains no gifts, and the teacher expects none in return. In the second way, the teacher provides complete freedom and no direction at all. This way is apt to produce a few splendid inventive sandcastles that are eventually abandoned on a beach strewn with empty beer cans. In the third way, which I stumbled onto, students operate with freedom and discipline. Freedom and discipline together. This, I think, is the most important takeaway there. They are given real choices and encouraged to learn the way of experts. What I also found striking about Macrorie's insights was how many of them go a step beyond what we would think as being a transformative approach to education. He was always interested in taking the next step. There's one section entitled Socratic, and it goes like this. A couple of years ago, I attended a general education conference where a young leader of a new school at the University of Chicago told me of his supposedly radical methods of teaching. He had found the Socratic method. At first, he won me because he admitted Socratic questions are not questions at all, but subterfuges. The teacher asks a question and pretends not to know the answer. It's a pulling, said the speaker, like grabbing the ring in the bull's nose, intended to jerk and shock and be somewhat painful. You've got to shake these middle-class kids up. In fact, that's your central duty, to confuse them and make them think for the first time. I became ill listening to that man. He was saying, meet students at their weakness, confuse them, and make them weaker. Then spring your stuff on them. If he were to turn that round to himself, to ask students to question him about the things he knew least about, how would he feel? How would he learn? There are insights like this littered throughout the book, and they really surprise me with their depth and their clarity, because they make it clear to me that what Macrorie wanted was not simply to be regarded as a teacher with a capital T, the best of the bunch, whatever. He wanted to really get to the heart of the matter. He wanted to figure out how this could be a better arrangement for everybody and not just, as this fellow was implying, just put one over his students for the sake of feeling like he was the smart one. There's another passage here, teacher power, that also impressed me. To teach the third way is to set up an arrangement which allows the majority of students in a class to find their own powers and to increase them. Making others powerful makes the teacher feel powerful, and the power of both is a fact. I have never before known such a feeling. There is no antagonism in it. It is not power for struggle, for besting others in intellectual or physical combat. It is akin to the feeling Gandhi had when he was chasing the British out of India and making them feel better men for it. I thought that was a really good way to sum up a lot of what his approach to this is that he's not trying to be the best man in the room. He's trying to find ways to empower other people to be better too. And again, part of why I wanted to mention all this in the context of what I'm doing on this channel is to reflect back on a lot of what I've said earlier about education, especially through things like John Holt's book, which is that if you're writing something that has a science fiction or fantasy flavor and you want education to be a part of it, it is useful to look at all the ways that people have tried to think differently about education in this world and to see how they could apply to that world. And I think this is a really good example. This book in particular has some really good nuggets for how to think about that. And since one of the things that we try to do with science fiction and fantasy is to suggest better possibilities, there is a great deal of that kind of, for lack of a better word, utopianism in this book. And I mean that in the best possible way. I mean it in the way that is summed up by the very last sentence in the book. And it reads, "Out of the corner of my eye these days, I sometimes see the glimmer of a world transformed by millions of persons who expect great things from each other." And I read that and said to myself, that sounds like the prologue to a way that we could think about how a completely different world could exist and be transformed by a completely different way of thinking about education, and how that would make a great science fiction or fantasy setting. So once again, the book is named Uptaught by Ken Macrorie. It is currently not in print. The printing that I have is from the original one from 1970. It's actually an ex-library edition, and one of the most depressing things about it is that there's still a library card pocket in the back with the card in it, and the card has absolutely no stamps on it. That's sad. It was reprinted in the 1980s, so you may be able to find copies of either the earlier or the more recent edition, but it has not been reprinted, and there is no digital edition of it. It's worth seeking out, it's worth thinking about, and I highly encourage anyone who's thinking about SF or fantasy with an educational aspect to it to pick it up and meditate on it, because it's just that good.